And for those of you who weren't here last time, I'll just briefly explain why we came up with this. And that was last year, it's about a year ago now, when there was a presidential election that surprised a lot of people. There were all kinds of folks who were talking about what they could do, what they couldn't do, how they could influence things from all sides of the political spectrum. And in talking about it, a lot of us realized we had gaps in understanding how the system actually worked. Most of us had a handle on the national, but especially on the state and the local level, we didn't really know who did what and why. So we came up with this idea, and we had one session on state government. Some of you were, I see faces, were here last time, about how state governments work, and particularly how New Jersey works, and how different it is from lots of other states. And tonight, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about local governments, how they work, what they're responsible for. Do they have the resources to do what they're responsible for? What's home rule? How do they affect our lives? So as part of that, we've invited Marc Pfeiffer, who is now in his third career within the whole large area of local government in New Jersey. He was, 2 months ago, or as of the last several years, he's now Assistant Director of the Bloustein Local Government Research Center. And he's also Principal in Pfeifer Government LLC. He's also, before that, he was part of the 10 years as a municipal official himself, 26 years with the New Jersey Division of Local Government Services. So he's had a long-term relationship and now has a huge knowledge base about how local governments work. So I'm going to turn it over to Marc. This is going to be a more informal presentation than last time. We encourage questions and thoughts, and take it away, Marc.
Thanks, Beth. Good evening, everybody. I just want to acknowledge we have some elected officials here tonight. It's always, protocol is always to recognize. We have the mayor, we have Councilman Hirsch hiding in the background. Not there. So I just wanted to say hi. I've worked with both of them in the past. Well, I normally do a PowerPoint presentation, but things just didn't quite work out for me in the last couple of days to get that done. So I'm just going to probably just sit here and work off the questions that I got from Beth. I've organized them a little bit into a different order, but I'm going to give you kind of the basics of local government, how it works in New Jersey. We do a course at the Bloustein School on local government administration. That's a whole semester long course. I am not collapsing that into 45 minutes for you. We're talking really, really fast to be able to do that, and it won't last long. So I'm going to give you an overview, and we're going to have lots of time for questions and answers. And hopefully I will at least cover some stuff that you will find useful, and we'll go from there. So the first question, one of the first questions that Beth had is this thing about what is home rule, right? And what does that mean in New Jersey? What are the advantages and disadvantages, the implications for effective functioning of local governments? Well, the principle of home rule comes down to one of two competing U.S. constitutional law cases that define the relationships that local governments have to their states. Because we have to remember that local governments are not mentioned in the federal constitution. So each state has its own constitution, which basically sets up the model of how they deal with local governments. And there's two general rules. The first one is what we call Cooley's rule. A guy named Denton Cooley, he had the case, he got the name on it. And said once a municipal government is created by a state government, that municipality can control what and how it does things, subject only to something that the state says, here's what you can't do. Now, that's Cooley's rule. Dillon's rule is the other one, where that basically says that once a municipality is created, it is a creature of the state and is subject to laws and rules that the state may impose upon it. Right? Now, you hear a lot about how New Jersey has home rule for its municipalities. So let me ask you a little quiz. Based on what I described, just what do you think? Are we a coolie, all right, which basically says the municipality has full control over what it does and how it does things once it's created, or are we a Dillon's rule, where it says the state dictates the power and how it executes? So we're recording this for TV, so I'll just ask for a show of hands. How many people think we're coolie? Raise your hand.
Well, can we say something else? Cruelly in disguise? With the other one in
I'm repeating instructions. Yeah, I gotta pick one of the two. Okay? One of the two. So how many think we tend Cooley? How many people we think tend Dillon? Well, congratulations. The Dillon people are right. All right? So despite the fact that here New Jersey is a home rule state, we are not what is considered home rule by 49 other states. Okay? Everybody else says, understands what they are. We do not have home rule in the traditional sense of other states. We have some aspects of home rule, right, which we'll get to in a moment or two. But generally, municipalities are created by the state, and they are subject to all the laws and rules that the state sets up and how they operate. There's basically fences. You can have a big subject, all right, like environmental, like policing. But the state sets up rules that you have to operate under. Some of them are flexible, some of them give you wide ranges of latitude, others do not. So for example, the way municipalities operate from a fiscal system, like how they budget, how they keep their books, those are dictated by state government, by the organization that I used to work for. Right? You can't create your own different thing about how you take legal action when it comes to finances. You've got to do it the way the state says. One of the advantages of that is that we have 565 municipalities. They all do it essentially the same way. Having that consistency from town to town works well. Where if you know how budgeting or finances works in one town, well, it's going to work pretty much, some variations on the theme, it's going to work pretty much the same way someplace else, which has a lot of value to society. All right, it creates less confusion. People may move from one town to another. They know that there are things that will be consistent. And it ensures a legal standard, all right, when it comes to things like transparency and disclosure, where the state says this is the way everybody does things. It provides a baseline, a floor, if you will, all right, of what information citizens have, what their rights are, right, and how a government conducts its business. Right? So that's that for us. There's some variations on the theme, as there might always be, but generally that's the rule. That consistency, is across what are really arbitrary boundary lines of our municipalities, and there's a whole separate story we could do on how municipalities got the boundary lines the way they did. Every municipality has a story behind that. Alan Karcher, who was the late Speaker of the Assembly, wrote a great book on it. I don't agree with his conclusions, but he did a great narrative of how municipalities got the boundaries that they have, and why New Jersey is the densest population, the most densely populated state in the country, has more municipalities per square mile than any other state. Right? Which is a very interesting and popular factoid. And I'll just diverge a little bit from the question and talk about a study that Dr. Ray Caprio and I, who together make up the Bloustein Local Government Research Center, we did some additional research and we found a couple other interesting factoids. Right? That although we have more municipalities per square mile, when it comes to number of people that populate those municipalities, on average, we're about 35th in the country. All right? Density matters. We have a lot of people that we stuff into different places. And a lot of those places, those small places, have a lot of people compared to other states. Right? We are very unique in that regard. All right? So that makes a difference. Right? Density has a lot to do about how New Jersey developed, right? And the decisions we make and the issues that we have to deal with. And those boundary lines and how they were created play an additional role in that. So home rule is a complicated concept in the state. It has implications because everybody can't do what they want. There are any number of people that decided to run for a municipal governing body, or just showed up and wanted to run for mayor, had lots of ideas, and once they got elected, they got very frustrated because they really didn't have a lot of appreciation for the environment and the rules under which government works. Right? We can argue about some of them, and that's a political debate about what the legislature has done or hasn't done over the years. But from a structural standpoint, we generally work reasonably well with reasonable protections for citizens, protections for employees, right? And for those who can be affected by government action. Right? It's consistent, it's generally consistent across boundary lines. So that leads us to the questions of what functions are local governments responsible for? How much power do they have to fulfill those functions? All right, well, the basic and most important powers that every municipality has and is responsible for ensuring that it's exercised are police powers, right? Public safety, basically, the policing function. And although we have 565 municipalities, only about 490 of them have their own police department. The rest are very rural places where policing is provided by the state police. And believe it or not, that has constitutional origins. The state just can't stop doing that. We had some litigation on that a couple years ago. The second most important thing that municipalities have full responsibility for, generally speaking, is land use regulation, zoning laws. Right? Under the state constitution, municipalities have exclusive, with an asterisk, rights to control their land use, what gets zoned where, right? Which means the county can't do it. We can't have counties do zoning under the current constitution. The asterisk, however, is that the state can impose zoning on municipalities. And the state has done that in 3 significant areas. The first one where we exercised that authority was the Meadowlands. Right? We had a tax sharing district. We said, okay, for environmental reasons, you municipalities over here, we're not going to let you develop all your land because it's environmentally sensitive. But you municipalities over here in the district, we're going to zone you for higher density, commercial and industrial, but you're going to have to share some of that rateable base, that property value, the taxes it brings, with the other guys who we're not letting grow. All right? That's the Meadowlands concept. There's only 2 places in the country that had that going for itself. The other place is the Minneapolis, St. Paul region. Right? The New Jersey Meadowlands for many years did this. It worked very well, except for some of the municipalities that had the growth didn't like the fact that they had to give money to the municipalities that didn't have growth. And a couple of years, the state legislature acted to change that formula around. Right? So the experiment lasted 30 plus years, really good idea. We kind of backed away from parts of it now. The second area where we did that was the Pinelands. Right? Environmentally sensitive, was starting to feel growth, and back under Governor Byrne, we said, okay, we're going to create a Pinelands Commission that is going to ensure that we're not going to grow in environmentally sensitive areas, and we're going to focus the growth in those areas where it makes sense from an environmental standpoint to have growth. Right? And they had to zone accordingly. There's a Pinelands Commission that was set up, like the Meadowlands Commission was, that enforces those rules. Right? Ups and downs over the years, some politics got involved and things like that, but that's the way we work. But that's pretty much intact. The third one, and most controversial, is the Highlands Area. All right, a swath of land from Passaic County that comes down through Morris, Passaic, and touches part of Sussex, goes into Hunterdon County as well. Right? Where we said, because of water supply issues, all right, and the growth that we've gotten in those areas, we're going to say, okay, we're going to cut off significant growth in those areas and limit growth, which is a zoning impact. And the state mandated that. If you've been following state issues closely, it is a hot potato of an item right now. It was established in the McGreevey administration around 2003, 2004. The last 8 years, some would argue that the Christie administration has tried to unwind some of the rules that were set up around it to try to reduce government state control over it and permit development. That hasn't really gone anywhere. It's a current political item that the legislature is dealing with, and that remains under a lot of debate. And you can have people have different opinions about it. If you were a landowner and you anticipated being able to develop your land, just like people who live 10 miles east of you did at one point, and you were anticipating that the farmland you had was going to be developed, it is your nest egg, it is the value that you have, and you were going to be able to basically be compensated for that. Now all of a sudden the state says, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to be happy about that, right? That's the kind of debate that we have there. So land use and zoning, other than those 3 examples, local control, right? We have some other variations on that theme. For example, as a municipality, you can't zone all your land for 5 or 10 acre per unit zoning, right? 1 unit per 5 acres or 10 acres, because that doesn't allow for affordable housing. And you've probably all heard of the Mount Laurel line of cases, which says, the Supreme Court said, every municipality has to provide a fair share of affordable housing. So that's a constraint on what was an unfettered zoning authority, right? And we have environmental issues, environmental laws and rules that talk about how you can build near waterways, right? Where water supply comes from, how wastewater is managed, how stormwater is managed. Those may also constrain your ability to zone the way you might otherwise want to, right? And we can throw historic preservation on top of that. And so there are a series of state laws that, as opposed to here, this wide an area that a municipality could zone, we have some fences established that sets up the environment in which those zoning laws can be created, right? And executed, what can go where and how. Another area is public health. Every municipality has responsibility to have what was originally called a Board of Health, and it's evolved in some ways where it's now a Department of Health, right, which can be contracted out as a shared service where another municipality can provide the service for you, or the county can provide the service for you. But it's the municipal governing body that makes those decisions about how public health programs will be administered, right? Pretty easy one, not terribly controversial, unless of course you want to change how the service is provided, going from your own employees to contracting with another municipality or the county government, which is usually done as a cost-saving measure. Similarly, and less dramatic, is construction code, what we normally call building codes, where we have a state code that says, here's the single state code on how structures are to be built. Here are the safety standards. Here's how walls get constructed and all those other details, right? We adopted that in the late 70s because up until that time, municipalities could have their own individual codes, which made it really hard for builders and homeowners to ensure they were getting the type of home or the type of structure that they should. Now, everybody uses the same rules, but the municipality has the responsibility to make sure those laws are enforced. Right? And they do that by providing it themselves, by hiring their own construction code officials, what we call subcode officials and inspectors, or they can contract that out to another municipality, and in some cases the county government may provide that service, and they can ask the county to do it, and in some extreme cases, where for small rural municipalities, they'll ask the state agency to come in and do it for them. Right? Those are the big ones, right? That municipalities must take responsibility for. But there's a whole other range of services that municipalities can provide or make decisions about. Solid waste collection, right? Water supply, wastewater treatment, right? Those are things a municipality can choose to engage in how it's being done, right? And again, there are laws that say, here's how you have to do it, or here's a range of options that you can choose from. Right? So, some flexibility, some not so flexible to do. And in all cases, there has to be an underlying state enabling legislation that says that you have this authority to do it in the first place. All right, you can't, there has to be something in state law, usually in Title 40 or Title 40A, for those of you that like looking at the laws, right, that there's some authority for you to do things. And there are some general grants of authority, particularly when it comes to public safety. But again, you know, speed limits, for example, there are rules that state government says about how you set speed limits. How you can do parking, the width of roads. Right? There are all kinds of things along those lines. So again, we work in a fenced-in environment. Another responsibility the municipality has is if they're going to engage in those things, they have to provide for administration. So you have the office of the municipal clerk. The municipal clerk is responsibility. You have fiscal activities, right? If you're raising property taxes or you've got money coming in that you're going to spend, you have to have a budget. You have to do financial reporting, right? Those are things that a municipality must do. Has to handle its personnel matters, right? If you're hiring people, you've got responsibilities that go with that. Actions taken by a governing body, you could be sued for some of those. Well, you've got responsibilities to defend yourself, right? All those add additional layers of complication as to what governments do. A quick note about counties. Because some people say, well, what's the county doing? Counties were initially created as a branch office of state government, providing responsibilities that the state has at the local level. So things like jails, originally courts, social services, elections. Right? These are all core things that county governments are responsible for doing for the region that they encompass. Over time, counties have assumed additional responsibilities. You know, they always had to do roads, for example. But the idea of providing public transportation systems is something counties have the option to do. We have environmental health responsibilities that were given to them by the state government. So every county must manage certain environmental health issues. That's their responsibility. Recycling is a responsibility given to county governments for the most part, right? At one point they had solid waste management responsibilities. The third thing that counties can do is they can provide some services to local governments. And depending on the structure of the county government, and I'll move back to that in a few minutes, a county government can provide services to municipalities who want to contract with it. For example, 911, emergency call taking and public safety dispatch. That can be contracted to county governments, and many of our counties have gone into that business because it was more cost effective for them to do it than for individual municipalities to maintain the service on their own. Right? That's been a big deal in county governments of late. Right? Because 911 service has become very expensive to do, the technology is getting better, municipalities need to refresh that technology and management, and they're finding, you know, it's something we really don't need to do, we can let the county do it, the service is good, they're providing to other municipalities, it all seems to be working out okay. So we have things along those lines. And again, in those cases as well, there needs to be some state law under which that provides you the authority to be able to do that. Next question. What is the basic structure of local governments? And what type of executives do they have? And what type of legislative bodies? And how many types of local government are there in New Jersey? So you've all probably heard, if you've been around for any period of time, you hear of some municipalities referred to as boroughs, towns, townships, cities. Some of you have probably heard that we have this thing called villages. We only have 5 of those. However, those are what we call the 5 traditional forms of New Jersey municipal government. Now, the difference in those 5 traditional forms is primarily in the structure and the role of elected officials, and how elected officials are elected. At one point, cities had more and greater authority than other places, and there's still some vestiges of that law around where places that are called cities have some special authority under certain circumstances. But generally speaking, today, there's no difference between them from their functional authority and the things they do. They all have police power responsibility. They all manage their lands. All those things I talked about before. Right? They're all pretty much the same. But what's different is how they are structured. How the mayor is elected. the role of the mayor with the governing body, how the governing body is elected, how many governing body members there are. Are they elected by wards, right, or at large, or a combination? Right? But we had those 5 basic forms which worked from about more or less the 1790s up through the 1940s. Right? Variations on the theme. We created boroughs in the late 1800s, and we had a lot of boroughs created for a lot of different reasons. That was part of the subdivision of the state, essentially, where townships broke up into multiple boroughs. That was fine. They had their reasons for doing that. But the idea is, in the early 1950s, people were saying, you know, we have this brand new constitution, it's very modern, it's up to date, but we still have these traditional forms of municipal government. Maybe we need to update those in some way. So we created what's called an optional municipal charter law, right? And that created variations on the theme. So a borough could adopt a different form of government. A township could adopt for example, a council manager form of government, where the council hires a manager to execute day-to-day affairs, and the mayor doesn't have power over the day-to-day affairs, right? A city could change from a city form of government to a strong mayor-council form of government, where you have a mayor elected at large, with an elected council that serves as a legislative body, and the mayor runs the administration, supported by a person called a business administrator, a full-time professional who runs the day-to-day stuff, right? So we created this, what we call this optional municipal charter law. Some of you may have heard it called the Faulkner Act, and the Faulkner name is because the chairman of the commission that brought us the law was the mayor of Verona, Mayor Bayard Faulkner at the time. So that was in the early 50s. But you have a lot of options now. And a municipality that doesn't like its traditional form, be it township committee, right, where basically you have X number of committee people, and it's usually traditionally based on population. You might have 3, you might have 5, you might have 7, right, where everybody is elected at large, right, for different terms, and the mayor is chosen by their peers from the governing body. And the mayor serves a 1-year term. In some places that mayorship rotates between individuals on the council. And in some cases where the politics work it, the mayor may serve for decades. Right? You have a borough form, which you folks have here, traditional form of government, where you have a mayor who's elected at large, and a council. Now, I don't want to mess up what the mayor's got going for herself. And previous mayors have had it. I've known several of them over the years. But the borough form is considered a weak mayor form of government. All right? Because the power of administration rests where? The council committees, for the most part. Where those council committees are meeting with the department heads and staff, meets with the public to make decisions about how a day-to-day administration is done. They may be assisted in many municipalities, such as Highland Park, by what's called an administrator, which is established by a general enabling ordinance that permits non-Faulkner Act municipalities, the traditional forms, to hire an administrator to execute day-to-day affairs and to manage those things on behalf of the governing body. Right? So that's the difference. Now, in some municipalities, the mayor, because of the political environment, becomes the de facto leader and in charge of the government. Right? In other cases, the mayor works at the whim of the council, and they've got to figure out how to work things out, because the mayor gets to run meetings and deal with the agendas. So and make appointments. And there's a balance of power that has to happen in those cases. So we have other forms of government. I said township committee, where they can rotate. We have the traditional town form of government, which we don't have a lot of anymore, because most towns have moved on from what we call a board of aldermen system. And don't ask me the root of board of aldermen, it's something in Old England. But we have a board of aldermen form, which has a governing body, kind of borough-like in a sense. But it has its own variations, and most of them today have moved on choose one of the Faulkner options. Now, the Faulkner options, again, you can have a full-time manager appointed to run the day-to-day affairs who becomes the chief executive officer, right? And the mayor has a secondary position there. We have a number of municipalities like that. We have variations on that theme where the mayor will run the governing body with a manager. We have variations where the council works on its own. The mayor does not vote in those cases, except in the case of a tie. New Brunswick, for example, has that system, that council, that mayor-council form of government with a strong mayor, right? And I worked in 3 of those as a business administrator, and I found that in addition to whatever political differences a municipality has and the competition for policy and decision-making there, that mayor-council form can create divisions between the legislative body, the council, and the executive, because in many cases, the legislative body really wants to tell the mayor how to execute things. And it's an interesting anomaly, and it works in a lot of cases, it works very effectively, but it has its tensions, right? We have other places where we have a strong council and an administrator who reports to the council, and the mayor is in charge of the council. So there's variations on the theme. To adopt one of those forms, you generally conduct what's called a charter study, and there's a process in state law that says, if you want to change your form of government, here's how you can do it. Most places that do it will create a charter study commission to study the form of government and make recommendations on if they want to change, what they want to change to, and that goes to a public referendum. Other cases, and this is the minority of cases, is where a group of citizens will say, hey, we want to change from what we have to this specific form of government. They'll get a petition signed and it will go on the ballot. And you then have a general election ballot fight over whether or not you want to adopt that particular form of government or not. And that's done without study. I would argue that, these things really make sense to study first and make some recommendations on it. Those are the variations, number of elected officials. The Faulkner Act provides different options, right? So if your municipality has grown, for example, you may want to say, well, instead of 3 elected officials, maybe we want 5 or 7. Maybe we want to increase the number to do that. In some cases, maybe you want to decrease the number. And you can do a change, if you're under a Faulkner Act, you can do a charter change to have that happen. So there's flexibility in how you can organize your municipal government, the role of the mayor, whether the mayor is a legislator or chief executive, right? Whether the governing body is legislative or involved in day-to-day affairs, right? It all depends on what the community's preferences are. What your history is, what your traditions are, all bleed into that. The next question is, what resources do local governments have to fulfill their responsibilities? Where do these resources come from? Like the state, county, local taxes and fees, and are there resources enough to get things done efficiently? Well, Beth, if resources mean money in this case, the answers are, I'm going to read what I wrote down here. Property tax, property tax, property tax, plus some fees, fines, grants you can get for specific purposes from state or counties or federal government, state aid that the state provides is just revenue to offset what would otherwise be raised in property taxes. Those are the big sources of revenue that municipalities get. The property tax, I can do a whole spiel on how property taxes work, but the general thing that drives property taxes is basically how much you plan to spend, right? How much other revenue, non-property tax revenue you get, and what's left over is the property tax levy, right? Total expenses less one revenue results in the revenue you have to raise by property taxes. The impact of property taxes on the average homeowner is then totally dependent on the property value of the municipality, right? And our property values per municipality vary all over the place, all right? Because those are a function of those arbitrary boundary lines that were established to create a municipality, decisions made in the past, and just arbitrary decisions by some governing body say, nope, we don't want this, and all of a sudden they change. A desire for a municipality to remain residential or farm-focused, and not zoning for other types of development that can come in. Right? Some of our municipalities that have the lowest effective property tax rates are ones that are rateable rich, right? That have big office complexes, big shopping centers. And I'll point out, everybody talks about shopping centers, we look at Paramus. Paramus is the shopping center capital of the world. There are no fewer than 3 significantly sized malls in Paramus, and they are surrounded on the left and right sides of 2 major highways by strip malls. All right, that's Paramus. Paramus is choked with traffic. They actually have blue laws in Paramus that prevent retail stores from operating on Sundays because they want a day off. They want a day off from traffic and want to be able to go places where it's relatively quiet. All right, the malls don't like that at all. But by the way, the American Dream project that's going into Meadowlands, you may have read about, what used to be called Xanadu, that's also in Bergen County. All right, 2 towns away from Paramus. All right, so there's interesting issues with that. But it's that rateable base, as we call it, which is the significant differentiator. All right, and the most significant differentiator that determines how much municipalities spend. Some of the work Dr. Caprio and I did highlighted that total spending in a municipality, or per capita spending, right, is primarily driven by having the availability of money to spend. Right, so having a lot of resources, rateable rich in these cases, can easily result in higher spending. Right, because we think about property taxes when we compare them to other places. All right, so, well, we got all this ratables, our tax rate is very low, well, we can do this and that, we can build a new community center, we can build a new school, we can pave some streets better, we can create a swimming pool, we can provide more amenities for our residents and still keep a relatively low tax rate because we have those big ratables available to us. And the dynamic is different in every municipality. There are effectively 565 different dynamics in the state, which makes it really, really interesting. And the decisions that are made in one generation clearly affect future generations, which is why planning and zoning issues need to be very carefully considered, because they're not just about now, they're not just about the next election, they're about what's going to happen down the road. And those things need to be really considered very carefully going forward. So property taxes are primarily, I got a funny line here, are primarily dependent on rateable base and demographics. The demographics define service needs, right? In most cases, if you have a very diverse population, you will tend to provide more services and different services to cater to those different, to meet the needs of those different demographics, right? If you are very homogeneous in your population, all right, you tend to be a smaller municipality to begin with, right? And as a result, you will provide a relatively sparse but reasonable level of services. One of the things that was discovered, and some of you may have heard of Professor Ernie Rioch, who recently passed away. He was like the gem of a resource for the state, was active since the early 50s in government affairs, just passed away at the age of 93, and was still coming to work 4 days a week until he fell ill. But Ernie had done a study, a very anecdotal study, where he had some students do surveys of elected officials in larger, medium, and small places. Said, what do you guys focus on? Larger places, larger population places, elected officials focused on services they could provide. A range of services, and different services, and more services. Again, they had a good rate. They would normally have a decent-sized rateable base for a larger place, generally. Smaller places, elected officials tend to focus on money. How much are we spending? Keeping an eye on what was being spent. Watching where every penny went. As a result, right? And because they pretty much, everybody knew them in town, in smaller places, everybody knew who the elected officials were, they tended to focus on being very fiscally conservative. There are other words you can substitute for fiscally conservative, but they basically hated spending money. And every dollar they spent got carefully scrutinized. And I think that's actually has a lot of resonance in most places, right? And how elected officials make the decisions about their spending priorities. And yet, there's nothing right or wrong, it's just different. Because the customs are different in a municipality, what residents are used to from municipality to place varies. I've sometimes referred to a municipality as having its own personality of what the expectations are. When people move to a municipality, they kind of adapt to what's going on in that place. People live there for a long time, they have expectations. Right? Those are those things. Let me go back. I talked about demographics, which drives service needs, plus a smidgen of politics. All right, because that's the thing, that kind of the glue that holds everything together. All right, politics gets a bad rap. Republicans versus Democrats, us versus them, and then when you have municipalities where there's single party control, you get factions within. All right, and you get competition within. So politics is not a bad thing, it's how we make public decisions. Right? It's the process that societies need a way of making those decisions, and in our culture, we do it through the political process, for better and for sometimes worse. Next question. What kind of impacts can our local government have on the lives of community residents? Well, I'd argue, particularly from some of the things I've said, pretty much a lot. It provides residents a practical sense of public safety. Right? Nobody wants to live in a town that is considered crime-ridden. So the actions of elected officials when it comes to public safety are kind of at the core of how people see their municipality and will affect how they think about it and how they respond. It supports property values. All right? For most people who own a home, that home is their single largest investment. And very arguably, municipal decisions that individuals think will negatively affect their property value will usually see opposition. Right? For better or for worse, that's what drives a lot of people. Nobody really wants to consciously support something that they perceive will lower their property values. All right? There are outliers to everything, and there are folks who will, right? Because it's for greater social good, for example, or they've got enough, the change won't be all that much. But that's a big deal. And people have to think about that, right? But support of property values is a key element of the effect of decisions made by elected officials. Particularly in these cases, not specifically mayor and governing body members. Just a quick parenthetical, I use the phrase governing body members, but depending on the type of municipality you're in, council members, all right, committee members, committee men, committee women in township committee form of government, right? We have some towns that refer to their council members as councilors, which is a local affect, right? We have our villages where we have trustees, and the mayor is called, what we call the mayor is called the village president. But those are the variety of terms that we have for these folks. That impact, those things like public safety, property values, amenities of why people want to move in that town, and that can have the reputation of a board of education, of having a good school district, or a school district that is acceptable to somebody at a given income and demographic level, what they can afford to live in. Those amenities, recreation programs, right? Are they very child focused? So they want good recreation programs for kids. Those types of amenities that are supported by elected officials and provided can contribute to the municipality as well, and the reputation that it has. That goes to that personality of a municipality. Next question, how can citizens influence their local government? Well, there's a couple of easy answers to that. The first is engage, and that's really the only, that's the big picture answer. It's engage at some level. If you want to be involved in your government, it's not going to happen by just sitting at home and accepting what everybody else does. You can make that decision, and many people do. All right? Example, personally, I've never voted in a school board election. Ever. All right? Never did. I've never had kids. I've never had to think about school issues. So I've made a conscious decision that I'm not going to ever be sufficiently informed enough to make a decision about school issues. So I'm willing to abdicate that decision to the people who are. It may not be moved to democracy, it doesn't work if everybody decided to do that. I wouldn't recommend it, but that's the decision. So people make different decisions for different reasons. Right? It doesn't make them good or bad people, just, okay, that's what works for them. And they then, of course, have to accept the outcome, all right, of that decision making. All right? You can't complain about it unless you're involved. And if you got to complain about something, make the complaint somehow become part of the solution. I know that sounds kind of trite, but that's the way things work in local government. How do you engage? Going to council meetings and let your thoughts know. Talk to your elected officials. Communicate with them. You don't want to do it in public in front of everybody, in front of a meeting that's going to be video recorded and then put on cable access TV. Send them an email separately. Talk to them after a meeting. All right? That's one of the prizes and privileges of being an elected official, is that your constituents have the right to talk to you pretty much whenever they want. See them in a supermarket, all right? See them in a sporting event, that's the nature of the job. All right? They don't want that, they don't have to run for office. Let's see, political process. Get involved in politics. You don't have to run for office, you can volunteer, right? Politics in some municipalities are not so much Republican versus Democrat, but from a viewpoint standpoint. We also have municipalities, by the way, that run on a nonpartisan basis, where the elections are not done on party labels. All right? We made what I think is a mistake a couple of years ago. Those elections, municipal elections, used to be held in May. That a nonpartisan election was not held at the general election. It was at a separate time. Now, the problem with those elections is that you don't get a lot of voter turnout. Right? So a couple of years ago, we passed a law that permits municipalities, in order to save the cost of paying for those May elections, to shift the nonpartisan election to November, but there'll be a separate part of the ballot that's not partisan based, and you can vote there. Higher turnout. That's a good thing. Does it get caught up in politics? Yeah. All right, it doesn't stop people from setting up labels or running campaigns based on that. But, 6 of one, half a dozen of another, it seems to work. Right? It's like school boards are nonpartisan. They've recently permitted school boards to move to a November election at a separate part on the ballot. But I think we're going to start to see slates of people running for office where you'll see, a Democratic slate, a Republican slate that may also include some school board people, because you can't stop people from doing that.
Which municipalities have the non-partisan?
Nonpartisan? Around here, not too many. I haven't looked at a list of those recently, but there's a small number of them who historically have been that way.
In New Jersey?
In New Jersey, absolutely, yes.
Oh.
Yes.
West Windsor's one.
Pardon me?
West Windsor.
West Windsor's one, yes. Definitely, yes. West Windsor's one. I probably have a list of them at my office. If you drop me an email, you want that, I can send it to you.
For what sorts of positions?
Those are nonpartisan, where people don't run with a party label.
But what positions are they running for?
For town council, governing body members,
Okay.
absolutely, and mayors.
Okay.
All right, you have different forms of, remember we were talking about the form of government, all right? Partisan versus nonpartisan is another option. I need to add that to my list. Didn't write that down. All right, just like, how many people are running? Well, one of the options is partisan form or nonpartisan form. Most New Jersey municipalities work on a partisan form. It is a minority of municipalities that use nonpartisan. And sometimes in nonpartisan, the groups might be, these are the Democrats who are running, these are the Republicans who are running. All
How
right?
do they support their campaigns?
Local contributions, and the usual way that every everybody running for government, they get contributions from folks. We've made campaign contributions, and you may want to do that as a future session, and I'm not the one to do that, but how people run for office, where campaign money comes from, because that's really interesting, and how it's evolved over time. We've made that a really interesting activity.
Citizen action.
It's really challenging. Political process, volunteer for that. Local interest-specific clubs and groups, right? Every town has people interested in particular issues, right? If there's not a group, you might want to start one. Social media enable, of all the interesting good and bad of social media these days, it's effectively good at helping people communicate with each other that have similar interests. All right, at the core, it's a really good thing to be able to do that. We've sort of abused that a little bit, but at the core, it's a really good, useful thing to be able to do. And finally, attend meetings and let people know how you feel. All right, that's at the core of this thing. That's how you can affect decisions that are made in your town. All right, and keep in mind that societally, many people have the viewpoint that their viewpoint is the most important viewpoint, and there's no reason why the elected official shouldn't be agreeing with them. Right? Well, look around you, there's a lot of other people that have that same thought. All right, and it makes it really tough to be an elected official today, because you've got people who have expectations, they're not met, they're not happy, and we have to start figuring out ways to better work those things out. We've lost the skill at solving those problems, and we sort of need to reclaim that. And again, there's outliers, there's places where it works really well and places where it doesn't. But we've kind of, that's a societal issue that I think we somehow need to address. So the last official question that Beth asked me, I think we're doing okay on time, Beth?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Is how is Highland Park viewed as a town in comparison with other boroughs and towns? What is our reputation or profile? Well,
According to whose study?
well, that's it. We're going to keep the door open here. So the question is well, the only person I can represent is my own. All right? Now, I will say that having been involved in New Jersey local government for over 40 years, 26 of it I worked for the regulator of local governance. I was fortunate in many ways to work with Highland Park officials and have a little bit of sense of Highland Park because I've done a number of activities and helped elected officials out over here. Mayor Frank, Ambassador Frank, whatever. I worked with her over the years. I go back to Mayor Mason, Dan Mason, which goes back like 30 years, I think. Something like that. I worked with, and one of my jobs in state government was to develop and promote shared services programs. So I worked with Freeholder Polos on those types of things, and when he was mayor as well. So I have a reasonable sense of the community. I've known people from here. Under certain administrations, I referred to as Highland Park as the public policy capital of the state, because we had a whole lot of people that lived in Highland Park that would commute to Trenton and were involved in the state legislature and the executive branch doing public policy work. That sort of shifted. Lambertville has provided competition for that over the years, where we see, so during the grieving courts years, a lot of people lived in Lambertville. So, yeah, I have a sense. So, I'm going to give you my perspective, all right? Has no meaning for anybody else. I suspect, though, you might agree. So here are my adjectives and verbs here. It's a very well-balanced community, exceptionally diverse, highly educated, politically active, with a high level of citizen engagement. It is very fiscally focused. They have very dedicated and generally responsive public officials. However, the communities, and this isn't a negative, but that gets balanced by sometimes things and people and the decision-making process can become a bit enthusiastic. That's what I got. All right. I suppose I can add the coda is that historically you've been very open to innovation. For example, when it came to shared services, you guys were right up there at the head of the line wanting to do things when we were promoting that in the 1990s and the 2000s. Those were big efforts by state government. You guys always wanted to talk about that stuff. I don't quite recall how executed they were, but there was always a lot of discussion about that.
Like which services?
I don't remember, I did not check my list off the top of my head. And by the way, there are services you may have shared at some point, but don't share anymore. Right? That's one of the interesting things about shared services. Very few of them are forever. All right, because times change, elected officials change, priorities change. If you're buying services from another municipality, their leadership may change and say, we don't want to do this anymore. Or we're going to raise the price. And you say, no, thanks, we're not going to buy it from you anymore. You've raised the price too high. We're going to go with some other partner or we'll do it ourselves. Right? So those things change, and generationally they change as well. Right? And that's probably not a bad thing, because it means you're going back and adapting to new circumstances of the day, and thinking about, well, what worked yesterday may not work today. And it's possible it may not work tomorrow. Because we introduce policies and execute policies based on the facts that are facing us at the moment and what we think may happen in the future. Sometimes the future doesn't work that way, the way you thought it would, which warrants you going back to revisit those decisions. That's a healthy thing to do. We keep doing things the way we've been doing them, well, maybe those reasons disappeared. Maybe technology has changed things. All right, one of the things that's starting to change, and this actually goes to the last question that came from somebody who's probably here, is how is government evolving, and are there new ways to do things? All right, technology clearly is a driver of doing things in different ways. All right? For example, why should a resident who wants to engage their elected officials on an issue of public policy have to show up at a specific night, at a specific place, at a specific time in order to make a public statement? That they have to be there. Why can't they have alternate ways of submitting that information? We're at the beginning, so I would argue, and I've been involved in technology my entire career. I've advocated for new tech solutions. I've developed and deployed tech solutions in local governments, and I teach a technology course at Bloustein right now on technology in cities. All right, so I'm up there on how this stuff works. I would argue we're at the beginning of how technology is changing civic engagement. Right? For example, so the question that was asked was, what are some newer ways that local governments gather input and engage the public in active participation in decision making? What is required for each? What are their limitations? And have these methods been evaluated for their effectiveness? Well, I'll talk about some of them. I can't give you an evaluation of effectiveness because we're at the beginning of that process. One of the challenges that local governments traditionally have had with technology, and I don't see it changing right away, is that we are, and I'll use the collective we, right? We are slow on the uptake. All right? We don't actively implement new technologies unless there's a motivation to. Right? We are concerned about the impact they may have. For example, we are concerned about the cost and its impact. Right? Why are we spending this money? What's the cost of this new technology? Will it be cheaper if we wait a year or two? What's happening in other towns on how this is working out? What are the unanticipated consequences that may happen as a result of it? Are we going to be criticized by some people for implementing this new technology? And if we're criticized for it, what is the effect of that going to be on our ability to continue governing? Right? Is that going to be a political implication? Private sector, when they adopt technology, and clearly today, the private sector drives technological change and adoption in society. All right? Private sector is constantly competing with each other to see what organization is going to take on the newest technology to make things better for consumers, to deliver their services better, to provide goods and services cheaper. You've got a competitive drive, all right, be it service focused, be it cost focused. So private sector's always been, I'd say always, normally at least in my 40 years of government, been ahead of the curve. Government follows. That lag can be as many as 5 to 7 years. All right? Because, well, how do we know this is working out? What is the cost? What are we going to be criticized for? Private sector, it's a profit and loss issue. It's sort of easy to make those decisions. In government, we clearly have a cost issue, but that profit and loss thing often gets translated to a political decision. All right? Who is this affecting? What happens if we do it? What are the political implications?
Do you have an example to give us?
So, one of the things that probably makes sense is was the uptake of police body cameras.
Oh.
Okay? That one didn't so much start in the private sector, but it was taking private sector technology and adapting it for specific public sector needs. A lot of uptake in the beginning. Sounds like the best thing for law enforcement, for officer accountability, for public accountability. All right? Yet we've been now on this road for about 4 or 5 years, and we're seeing that maybe it's not the best thing that ever happened, or maybe we need to figure out how to manage it better. All right? We have questions of cost. Right? Well, we're recording all this stuff. It has to be stored. Storage isn't free. You're paying for a service for that. Right? We have process to make sure that the devices keep working. Right? If the officer is in a scuffle and it falls off, it becomes useless. The department gets criticized. Well, you had cameras, they didn't work. What was the point of this? Right? Yet we have the accountability that it brings in a normal traffic stop, for example. Those things work out really well. Complaints against police officers have gone down in a lot of jurisdictions that have used them because of that. Because the complainant says, well, it's his word against mine. Now let's go to the videotape. Right? Those create different challenges. What about a citizen who's a bystander, all right, to an event that gets recorded? And maybe that citizen doesn't want to be known as having been in that location. And now it becomes a public record. Right? And what are our rules about, and the technology now where you say, okay, we're going to blur the faces of people. Right? Well, that has its own cost. Are we willing to accept those costs? Right? So that's one example. And we have other things like public meetings. I used that example before. How come we can't do things with public meetings better and get more ways for people to get involved? Yeah, we probably can. All right? We could turn our meetings into go-to-meeting type webinars, where we have different people speaking, and people can listen in from home and use the software to ask a question. All right? Great. It's a great, interesting idea. What are its implications? Does it have the effect now of making meetings run much longer because now we've enabled more people to engage? Well, getting more people to engage is generally a good thing. All right? But the unanticipated consequence of it may be we now have meetings running to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and have a real problem making decisions. All right, we have not addressed the impact of technology on our democratic institutions and how they work. We see some of the challenges we have there, because our culture has been, I would suggest, again, personal opinion here, has been really, really good and shown a remarkable capacity of outliers messing up otherwise really good ideas to the detriment of everybody else. And you've all seen and read about it. Trolls, all right? People jumping in with ideas, bullying, creation of fake news, by whatever definition you want to use for fake news. Those types of issues can seriously detract from how we allocate our resources. And now I know that Beth talked about, when she asked the question about resources, we're talking about money, but I would argue that we also have 2 other resources that we think about when we're running organizations: time and attention. Right? So those 3 resources of time, attention, and money are the things that government officials have to spend. Right? We don't know how all of these new technologies will play out. A lot of experiments going on. There's public polling applications that are out there where if you've got a public question, or you have an issue before the public, you can create some polling. Online polls available. SurveyMonkey, you've got all kinds of tools out there that you can do. We now have tools that permit us to communicate with citizens easily via email or text message. All right, so we can create mailing lists. All right, great, we can do those things and use those tools to have self-selected people express their opinion. Okay, a lot of what we do is self-selected anyway. People come to council meetings who have an impact at council meetings are effectively self-selected. All right, that's fine, that's worked for a long time, we can keep doing that. We are electing people to use their judgment to balance those things out of the people who bothered to show up who are self-selected and those people who didn't show up, all right, who may not have known, couldn't come out to be there at Tuesday night at 7:30, right, to make their comments. Could be any number of options there. Governing body members have the responsibility to figure out and balance all those different interests, right? Yes, we can do more. I think polling is an interesting opportunity. There are some governing bodies, I think, who are experimenting with live streaming of governing body meetings and providing ways people can communicate their comments. Twitter hashtags for those people who have Twitter accounts. We have Facebook pages. Some governments have Facebook pages. They're open for comments. People are making all kinds of range of comments. And they have the ability to say, okay, we're going to get rid of anything that's harassment or bullying types of things or inappropriate, not related. But sometimes get in trouble because people complain about that. We've got freedom of speech issues involved in that. It's really hard. Government has issues with technology that the private sector doesn't have because we have different expectations. So we try to balance all of those things together. So we have more and more places that are doing live streaming of meetings. All right? There are a couple ways you can accept input. There's some formal apps you can use for input on issues. There's survey tools. We have more and more governments are doing meetings online, putting more data and documents online, improving transparency that way. All right, opening up government data and putting that online. In our current world of Oprah, we have people now who are arguably using Oprah at an abusive level. Some people are using Oprah for really good purposes, but that adds cost and time and attention to the government in responding to those Oprah requests. And that's really becoming a very thorny issue in some government agencies. I'm almost done, because I see we got some questions out here. So in answer to that question, streaming of meetings, more information online, polling applications. There's also a service called Neighborly. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's neighbor.ly. It basically it's a kind of a Facebook thing for neighborhoods. All right, where individual neighborhoods can create a neighborly thing, which permits neighborhoods to have a voice that they can then use to communicate to their elected officials. Some municipalities are using that as an organizing tool to give their citizens a way to communicate to the government. Police departments are using it as well. That can be a very effective crime information tool. Right? Because now you say, hey, we're seeing some burglaries in this neighborhood. Make sure you don't leave your car outside unlocked with the key fob in it. Right? Don't laugh. Where I live, the local newspaper, I still read the local newspaper every week. There are people reported, neighborhood, car stolen, car was left unlocked, and the key fob was left in the car. All right, well, that's happening. You can use Neighborly and other apps like that to be able to report and communicate that kind of information. So there's some new tools that are developing. We're sort of at the beginning. A company that may be deploying one service this week may be out of business in 6 weeks. All right, so government is normally very conservative when it comes to adopting new tech. We clearly have some outlier leaders who are the ones who stick their neck out, where their community personality can facilitate that type of engagement. So we're seeing people starting to do things like that, to use polling applications, to put more and more information online, to stream their meetings.
Which municipalities in New Jersey?
Some of them do very different things. South Orange, for example, is doing putting a lot of information online. I think Montclair is doing streaming of meetings and trying to find a way where folks can communicate during meetings. Right? I don't do an inventory of exactly who's doing what, but I read enough and I see enough and talk to people know that there is experimentation going on. All right, and there are some folks, there's always outliers who are ahead of the curve. I don't have any wonderful closing statements, but just to say that I hope this was useful to you folks and people who are going to see this later. I hope it's informative, and now we've got some time for questions. So go ahead.
Hi, quick question. I think you made a really great point about the engagement, right? Using technology to have virtual town halls, or whatever the case may be. Speaking from the civic tech side, what are some things you can recommend when you approach municipalities to kind of overcome the initial fear or concern of the unknown, especially when your platform is a big jump in terms of what is available if you've developed something very specific?
That's hard. I think you have to understand what the concerns that those elected officials are going to have and what you're going to do or how the system will mitigate those. It's all about risk. A lot of local government decisions are about risk assessment, though not consciously so. So if you're approaching somebody, they're going to want to say, okay, what is the risk that I'm taking in doing this? That risk, how much money I'm going to spend? Is it being mocked? If it fails, am I going to be blamed politically for this? What are the risks that I, as an elected official or an administrator, are going to take by deploying this tech? All right, so it may be, maybe there needs to be a grassroots request that the government start doing whatever. All right, and if the government sees that there's public support for that idea, that reduces the risks. All right, very few public officials make decisions without considering what are very practical and valid risks. And so, did that answer your question? Because we have an elected official who wants to comment.
Yeah, we've had some conversations before. So the other thing that we have to be concerned with are things like OPRA or OPMA requirements. Open public records or open public meetings, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about.
It's not that Oprah. Not that Oprah.
So for instance, one of the concerns that our attorney for the municipality has raised with us is as we start engaging with some of residents who write on Facebook, does that communication then become something that we need to include in open public records requests for anything that any elected official has said about trees, for instance. And so, you know, we have, here in Highland Park, we have 5 main objectives and goals that I've set for the council, and the last one is transparency. So I am very much in favor of exploring technology that will allow us to be even more transparent. But there's pushback from the legal side of things, not so much pushback, I shouldn't call it that. It's forewarnings.
Yeah.
You know, how are you going to save the data or the communications online so that if somebody says, I'm opering everything the mayor has ever said about trees, how are we going to get that information?
See, what's interesting, and that Oprah issue is a huge one for municipalities, particularly where it intersects with tech. Oprah was written in about the year 2000. We were just gone through Y2K, and Oprah was effectively being drafted at that time. We were not using email on a regular basis. We had very rudimentary websites. No video, no Facebook, no Twitter, nothing. Oprah tried to recognize electronically stored documents, but the accessibility was very limited because we were just using floppy disks at that point on how we stored our documents. All right. I had the privilege of having to introduce the Open Public Records Act to government officials and the public because I was the initial acting executive director of the Government Records Council. I got the start up. It wasn't as good a startup as, you know, a private sector startup, believe me. But Oprah was not written understanding, with taking into account the technology we have today. And the definition of records, what's disclosable, what's not disclosable. The challenges of people asking for voluminous requests was not very clear. And the courts have made it more difficult for municipalities to cover their costs. It's been argued in the past that Oprah was this incredible state mandate that was placed on local governments because over time it has resulted in a significant increase of time and pension and money to respond to Oprah requests. Now, public have a right to know what's going on? Absolutely, right? But there needs to be balance, all right? And we have people who, and we always have outliers who push the limits. We've had people submit 30 requests a day for all kinds of different records. It's been used for political purposes, for opposition research, where people request, I want to see every vote, records of every vote Councilman X made over the last 4 years. All right, that's an interesting request. Very challenging for the records custodian, usually the municipal clerk, to fulfill. Other records requests are incredibly valid and relevant, but government's not allowed to pass judgment on the validity or necessity of somebody getting records, and it's probably inappropriate for government to do so. Right? It's also been used in litigation as a form of legal discovery that doesn't have the costs or the burden on the parties of legal discovery. Right? So there's all kinds of really interesting challenges we have with Oprah, and we haven't figured out a way to try to solve those yet. And that's a challenge unto itself. Yes?
I found very effective these town meetings that people that are running for office hold, that you can call up and be part of that. Now, is that a part of public record as well?
If that is done in a political context, no. If it's candidates who are running, that's not covered under Oprah. All right? If it's a government-sponsored forum, if the government has something like that, yeah. If it's recorded in some way, it's disclosable. If it's not recorded, there's no record. Okay? Somebody else? Yes?
So just on a slightly different topic, going back a little bit, but you talked about a great way to get involved is through like a commission, a committee. What's the difference between a committee, a commission, a board, and what is the effect of each and how much impact each can have?
Okay, well, generally speaking, a board is an entity that has decision-making authority. Now, those decisions in some cases might be recommendations, but generally speaking, if it's a board, they make decisions on some set of standards like a planning board or zoning board. They make decisions that could also be legally appealed, right? Board of Health the same way. Commissions work similarly. A commission will be very specialized and if it's working under a state law, have a very prescribed role. For example, environmental commissions. Environmental commissions have specific responsibilities and mandates of what they can do. They have some authorities, but generally they're providing advice, right, at the local government level. State commissions are something else where we have commissions that actually make decisions and execute services. But at the local level, most, not all commissions provide advisory information, but there are some that actually run things and make decisions. Like, for example, in the school world, we have educational service commissions, all right? And they provide student services and educational services for boards of education. Right? So that's an operating entity. Commissions go one way or another depending on its structure and how it's set up. Committees are generally those things established by a governing body to provide input and advice on policy issues or to coordinate some type of an initiative. For example, municipalities that participate in and this actually may not be a good example, Sustainable Jersey create green teams. They're not under the direction of the government, but the government may be involved in them. Some organizations will establish a cable TV committee to provide input on cable TV issues to the governing body. So you can have committees provide information and advice and guidance, and sometimes may run programs. For example, our drug alliance groups, our alliance organizations are effectively committees set up by municipalities to provide some drug awareness, education, and advice to the governing body on local issues. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
So going back to technology a little bit, so I'm familiar with, and I think it's being done in Princeton called, I think it's called Civic Hackathons,
Yes.
which are actually very cool, where people who are willing to, who are developers, right? They will go to the community, the governing body, the mayor, whomever, and say, do you have a need for something? Like in Princeton, they put one together for people to be able to figure out where they can go to park, because parking is a big problem in Princeton, okay? And there was something, I don't remember what it was, but are you familiar with that?
With the Princeton hackathons, yes, I was actually served as a judge on their last hackathon.
Yeah.
And I've been participating in a number of hackathons, either providing support or a judge.
It's been something I've been thinking about. I was a software developer my whole life, about trying to do with Highland Park, although I haven't participated in it, so I don't know exactly how it's put together.
So there's a lot of ways hackathons can be put together, some very effective, some not so effective. We've had a lot of good experiments which we thought would work out really well, but didn't have staying power, where there was no incentive for the results that came from it to be implemented.
Right.
Kind of the follow-through is the big challenge of hackathons, all right, and having a structure that has that where you can provide incentives for people to come up with good ideas, and the execution becomes the problem. Or I should say, execution becomes the challenge. Right? They can be great motivators to bring people out, get them engaged, help identify challenges. It may provide a pathway to a different solution. It may provide, okay, here's what we've learned on the process. Well, and now we've learned this. Maybe here's a direction we can go, or maybe it's a direction we know not to go. But execution of the results of the hackathon, if you're looking for an app.
Do you mean execution or do you mean implementation?
And, well, yes, the implementation, getting the result of the hackathon executed, having the good software developed, because what comes out of a hackathon is seriously alpha or beta.
Okay, got it.
All right, so you've got to get more work done, all right, to make sure it's usable. Make sure it's secure, because when you're building something over a weekend or a couple of days, security is not the thing you're primarily thinking about. These are all issues and challenges that we have to deal with. So they can be very effective motivators, they can be great educational opportunities to learn about issues, but they have to be very carefully constructed and not over-dramatize that it's going to solve this remarkable problem.
Which one have you seen that actually worked?
I haven't. I've seen some real good ideas, but they've required a couple other generations. Princeton's had a couple things that have started to work. One of the things I've also seen is that a lot of ideas people come up with, there's already existing solutions for it.
Right.
They just didn't know about it.
We're running out of time. One last question, and then we're gonna turn it down. People done?
I just have a question about, at the beginning, you had mentioned that you taught about local government. I was just, because I can't remember, if you could just reiterate the institution that you work for?
Okay, I work at the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. We have several courses there on government type things, from a policy program. We have a program on urban municipal management, which basically is a how-to course on how to run a city and different services. And I'm currently teaching a course called Cyber Cities, which examines the impact of technology on cities and the way people live in cities, which is pretty much living anywhere.
Thank you.
Okay?
Like to
All right, thank you very much. Spending your evening here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.